Sarah Mitchell had been planning this trip to London for 3 years. At 28, she worked as a marketing coordinator in a small town in Ohio, and this was her first time traveling outside the United States. Her camera bag was packed with 3 different lenses, extra batteries, and enough memory cards to capture every moment of her dream vacation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as Sarah approached Buckingham Palace. She had woken up at 5 in the morning, determined to beat the crowds and get the perfect photographs. Her guidebook, dog-eared and highlighted in multiple colors, promised that the changing of the guard ceremony was a must-see attraction. Sarah had spent hours the night before in her tiny hotel room, watching YouTube videos about the best spots for photography. She had memorized the schedule, studied the uniform details, and even practiced adjusting her camera settings in different lighting conditions. This was going to be the highlight of her entire trip. As she walked through the gates, Sarah was struck by the grandeur of everything around her. The palace stood magnificent against the morning sky, its windows gleaming like jewels. Tourists were already gathering, but Sarah had managed to secure a spot near the front of the crowd barriers. She pulled out her camera and began taking test shots, adjusting the settings as the light changed. The anticipation was building, and she could feel her heart racing with excitement. This was it. She was really here at one of the most famous places in the world. Other tourists began to arrive, chatting in various languages. Sarah smiled at a family from Japan who were setting up their own camera equipment nearby. An elderly couple from Germany asked her to take their photo in front of the palace gates, and she happily obliged. The atmosphere was festive and friendly. Street vendors sold postcards and small Union Jack flags. Children pressed their faces against the barriers, wide-eyed with wonder. Sarah felt like she was part of something special, a moment in history that she would remember forever. As the clock approached the ceremony time, Sarah noticed the crowd growing thicker behind her. She was grateful for her early arrival and prime position. Her camera was ready, her settings perfect for the lighting conditions. She had even brought a small step stool to get better angles over the heads of other tourists. Then, in the distance, she heard the first sounds of hoofbeats on stone. The ceremonial guards were approaching on their magnificent horses. Sarah's pulse quickened as she raised her camera, ready to capture every moment of the spectacle she had traveled so far to see. The horses appeared first, their coats gleaming in the morning light. The guards sat tall and proud in their red uniforms, their expressions serious and focused. Sarah began clicking rapidly, her camera capturing frame after frame of the impressive procession. But as the ceremony continued, Sarah noticed something that wasn't in any of her guidebooks or YouTube videos. One of the horses, a beautiful bay mare with intelligent dark eyes, seemed to be looking directly at her. The horse's ears were pricked forward, and there was something almost curious in her expression. Sarah lowered her camera for a moment, mesmerized by the animal's presence. The horse was stunning, powerful, graceful, and clearly well-trained. Her coat shone like polished mahogany, and her tack was immaculate, every piece of leather and metal gleaming with careful maintenance. The guard riding the mare sat with perfect posture, his red tunic bright against the morning sky. His black helmet was positioned precisely, and his expression remained stoic and professional. He stared straight ahead, seemingly unaware of the hundreds of tourists watching and photographing his every move. Sarah raised her camera again, focusing on the horse and rider. Through her lens, she could see even more detail. The intricate braiding of the horse's mane, the polished buttons on the guard's uniform, the way the morning light caught the metal of the bridle. As the ceremony progressed, Sarah found herself becoming more and more fascinated by this particular horse. Unlike the others who seemed focused solely on their duties, this mare appeared to be taking in her surroundings with genuine interest. Her ears moved constantly, picking up sounds from the crowd, and her eyes seemed to observe everything around her. Sarah began to imagine what it must be like for these horses, participating in ceremonies day after day, surrounded by crowds of excited tourists. Did they enjoy the pageantry, or was it simply routine for them? This mare, at least, seemed engaged with the world around her, rather than simply going through the motions. The formal ceremony concluded, but Sarah noticed that some of the guards remained positioned around the palace grounds. The mare and her rider took up a post not far from where Sarah was standing. Other tourists began to disperse, heading off to their next destinations, but Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. She packed away her camera equipment slowly, Taking one last look at the horse who had captured her attention, the mare stood quietly now, her rider maintaining his ceremonial silence and stillness. But Sarah could swear the horse was still watching the remaining tourists with that same curious, intelligent expression. As Sarah finally prepared to leave, she felt a strange pull to get closer to the magnificent animal. Her guidebook had mentioned that tourists often took photos with the guards and horses, though it warned about maintaining respectful distance and following all posted rules. Sarah looked around and noticed a few other tourists taking selfies near the barriers, some even approaching the horses for better photos. The guards remained motionless and silent, maintaining their ceremonial duties even as cameras flashed around them. With her camera bag slung over her shoulder, Sarah took a few steps closer to where the mare and her guard were stationed. She could see the horse even more clearly now, the gentle slope of her neck, the alert positioning of her ears, the way she stood with patient dignity despite the commotion around her. Sarah had always loved animals. Growing up on a small farm in Ohio, where her grandmother kept horses, she recognized the signs of a well-trained, well-cared-for animal. This mare was clearly in excellent condition, her muscle tone perfect, her coat healthy and shining. The distance between Sarah and the horse seemed to shrink as other tourists moved around them. Sarah found herself wondering if she dared to get close enough for a really spectacular photograph, the kind that would make her friends back home truly understand the majesty of this experience. Looking at the mare's beautiful, intelligent face, Sarah made a decision that would change the entire course of her London vacation. Sarah stepped closer to the magnificent mare, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. The horse stood like a statue, but her dark eyes tracked Sarah's movement with unmistakable awareness. The guard above remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But Sarah noticed his hands had shifted slightly on the reins. The morning crowd had thinned considerably after the main ceremony ended. Most tourists had moved on to other attractions, leaving only a handful of dedicated photographers and curious visitors lingering around the palace grounds. Sarah felt emboldened by the quieter atmosphere and the seemingly relaxed demeanor of the remaining guards. She had always been confident around horses, thanks to her childhood spent helping her grandmother care for their small herd of rescue horses back in Ohio. She understood horse behavior, could read their body language, and had never met a horse that didn't eventually warm up to her gentle approach. This royal mare seemed different from the farm horses she knew, though. There was something regal about her bearing, an almost human-like intelligence in her eyes. Her breeding was obviously superior. Sarah could see it in every line of her conformation, from her elegant head to her powerful hindquarters. As Sarah approached, she noticed details that hadn't been visible from a distance. The horse's tack was incredibly ornate, with polished brass fittings that caught the morning light. The leather was supple and well-maintained, obviously cared for by expert hands. Even the horse's hooves gleamed with polish, and her mane was braided with military precision. The guard's uniform was equally impressive up close. Sarah could see the intricate embroidery on his red tunic, the perfect polish of his boots, and the way every element of his appearance had been meticulously prepared. She marveled at the discipline required to sit so still and maintain such perfect posture for extended periods. Sarah raised her camera and took several shots from different angles, each click of the shutter seeming loud in the relative quiet of the morning. The horse's ears flicked toward the sound each time, but she showed no signs of nervousness or agitation. If anything, she seemed almost curious about Sarah's presence. Emboldened by the horse's calm demeanor, Sarah took another step closer. She was now within arm's reach of the mare's nose, close enough to see the fine whiskers around her muzzle and the long, thick eyelashes that framed her intelligent dark eyes. The horse's nostrils flared slightly as she caught Sarah's scent, processing this new information with the thoroughness of a well-trained military animal. Sarah could almost see the wheels turning in the mare's mind as she evaluated this approaching human. Sarah had brought some sugar cubes in her jacket pocket, a habit from her grandmother's farm, where treating horses was a daily occurrence. She pulled out one of the cubes, thinking that perhaps the mare might enjoy a small treat. After all, the horses she had known always appreciated a little sweetness during their workday. The sugar cube sat in Sarah's palm as she extended her hand slowly toward the horse's muzzle. She had done this hundreds of times before with her grandmother's horses, and it had always been a wonderful way to make a connection with the animals. The mare's nostrils flared wider, as she caught the scent of the sugar. Her ears pricked forward with obvious interest, and she lowered her head slightly, stretching her neck toward Sarah's outstretched hand. Sarah felt a thrill of connection with this magnificent animal, this living symbol of British tradition and pageantry. What Sarah didn't realize was that royal horses are trained under completely different protocols than farm horses. They are conditioned to ignore distractions, to remain focused on their duties regardless of what happens around them. They are taught that their job is to carry their riders with dignity and discipline, not to interact with members of the public. The mare's training warred with her natural curiosity and the enticing smell of the sugar cube. Her instincts as a horse drew her toward the offered treat, while her military conditioning told her to remain at attention and ignore civilian distractions. Sarah waited patiently, her hands steady and her voice soft as she began to murmur the kind of gentle words she had always used with horses. She spoke about what a beautiful girl the mare was, how shiny her coat looked, how proud she must be to have such an important job. The guard above still hadn't moved or spoken, maintaining his ceremonial silence. Sarah took this as permission to continue her interaction with his mount. She assumed that if her behavior was inappropriate, someone would have said something by now. The mare stretched her neck a little further, her soft muzzle now just inches from Sarah's palm. Sarah could feel the horse's warm breath on her hand, and could see the genuine intelligence and curiosity in those dark eyes. This was the moment she had been hoping for, a real connection with one of these legendary animals. Sarah kept her movements slow and deliberate, exactly as her grandmother had taught her years ago. She knew that sudden movements could startle horses, and the last thing she wanted was to cause any problems. She was being careful, respectful, and following all the horsemanship principles she had learned during her childhood. The sugar cube seemed to sparkle in the morning light as Sarah held it steady in her palm. The mare's interest was obvious now. Her entire attention was focused on the treat, and Sarah could see the horse's mouth beginning to work slightly in anticipation. Other tourists nearby had noticed the interaction and were beginning to gather, their own cameras ready to capture what looked like a charming moment between a visitor and one of the famous royal horses. Sarah felt proud to be the center of this positive attention, the tourist who had managed to make friends with one of London's most iconic animals. The mare took one more step forward, closing the final inches between her muzzle and Sarah's outstretched palm. Sarah could practically feel the horse's warm breath and could see every detail of her beautiful face. The moment felt perfect, like something out of a fairy tale. Sarah smiled broadly, imagining how impressed her friends and family back home would be when she showed them photos of this magical encounter. She could already picture posting the images on social media with captions about her amazing connection with British royalty's own horses, the mares. Lips were just about to touch Sarah's palm when everything changed in an instant. What Sarah had interpreted as friendly curiosity was about to reveal itself as something entirely different, something that would transform her dream vacation into an experience she would never forget, for completely unexpected reasons. The mare's massive head suddenly snapped upward with explosive force, her eyes rolling white with what Sarah now realized was not curiosity, but barely contained aggression. In that split second, Sarah's dream encounter transformed into her worst nightmare as 1,200 pounds of highly trained military horse reared up on her hind legs, front hooves pawing the air just feet above Sarah's head. The sugar cube went flying from Sarah's palm as she stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mare's powerful front legs struck down toward the ground with tremendous force, missing Sarah by mere inches. The sound of iron horseshoes hitting stone echoed like gunshots across the palace courtyard. Sarah's camera fell from her shoulder as she scrambled away from the angry horse, her hands scraping against the rough cobblestones. The mare's ears were now pinned flat against her head, and she was snorting and stamping, her entire body language screaming warnings that Sarah should have recognized much earlier. The guard above the horse never moved from his position, but his voice rang out sharp and clear across the courtyard. "Stand back! Do not approach the horses." His words carried the authority of military, training and years of experience dealing with situations exactly like this one. Other tourists, who had been gathering to watch Sarah's interaction, now scattered in all directions, their own cameras forgotten as they sought safety behind barriers and columns. Children cried as their parents pulled them away from the chaos, and several people were shouting in languages Sarah didn't understand. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what had gone wrong. This was nothing like her experiences with her grandmother's gentle farm horses. Those animals had been trained for companionship and work alongside humans. This mare was something entirely different, a weapon as much as a mount. Trained for ceremonial duties and crowd control, the horse continued to dance sideways, her movements powerful and controlled despite her obvious agitation. Every muscle in her body was tense, ready to strike again if Sarah made another wrong move. The mare's training was evident even in her anger. She was dangerous but disciplined, threatening but not out of control. Sarah realized with growing horror that she had misread every signal the horse had been giving her. What she had interpreted as friendly interest had actually been the mare assessing a potential threat. The horse's forward ears hadn't indicated curiosity but alertness. Her stretched neck hadn't been reaching for a treat but preparing to defend herself and her rider. Royal horses, Sarah was learning in the most frightening way possible, are trained to view unsolicited human contact as a security risk. They are conditioned to protect their riders and maintain their positions regardless of civilian behavior. Sarah's approach with food had likely triggered every defensive instinct the mare possessed. The guard's voice rang out again, this time directed at the growing crowd of onlookers. Please maintain distance from all horses and guards. This is for your safety and theirs. His tone remained professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension that suggested this was not the first time such an incident had occurred. Sarah found herself pressed against a stone pillar, her back to the cold marble as she watched the mare gradually calm down. The horse was still snorting and tossing her head, but her hooves had returned to the ground, and she was no longer actively threatening anyone. A security officer appeared as if from nowhere, his radio crackling with rapid communications in official-sounding codes. He approached Sarah with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with tourist incidents regularly. His expression was stern but not unkind as he assessed the situation. "Are you injured, miss?" the officer asked, his accent crisp and professional. Sarah shook her head, though she was beginning to feel the sting of scraped palms and a bruised knee from her fall. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in her cheeks as she realized how badly she had mishandled the situation. The officer's radio crackled again, and Sarah caught fragments of conversation about incident reports and tourist safety protocols. She began to understand that her impulsive decision to approach the horse had triggered an official response that would likely have consequences far beyond her own embarrassment. Other guards were now converging on the scene, their movements coordinated and efficient. Sarah noticed that several tourists were being questioned by additional security personnel, and she realized that her moment of poor judgment had disrupted the entire operation of this section of the palace grounds. The mare had settled into an uneasy quiet, but her eyes remained fixed on Sarah with unmistakable wariness. The horse's message was clear. She would not tolerate any further approach, and next time her response might be even more dramatic. Sarah shuddered to think what could have happened if those powerful hooves had actually made contact with her head or body. "Miss, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here," the security officer said, pulling out a small notebook. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized this was becoming an official incident, not just an embarrassing moment she could walk away from and forget. The guard on horseback remained silent and motionless, but Sarah could sense his disapproval radiating down from his elevated position. She had disrupted his duty, endangered his horse, and created a security situation that required official response. Her dream photo opportunity had become a nightmare of bureaucratic consequences. Other tourists continued to give the area a wide berth, and Sarah could see people pointing at her and talking in hushed tones. Some were still taking pictures, but now she was the subject rather than the photographer. Her role had shifted from eager tourist to cautionary tale in the span of just a few terrifying seconds. The security officer's questions were thorough and professional. He wanted to know her name, her hotel information, whether she had been drinking, whether she had any experience with horses, and exactly what had motivated her to approach the animal with food. Each question drove home the seriousness of what had occurred. Sarah answered honestly, explaining her background with horses and her assumption that the mare would welcome a friendly interaction. The officer listened without comment, occasionally making notes in his book. His expression suggested that he had heard similar explanations many times before, from well-meaning but misguided tourists. As the official questioning continued, Sarah became aware of a growing crowd of onlookers. Word of the incident had spread, and people were gathering at a safe distance to see what was happening. Sarah felt exposed and foolish, wishing she could disappear into the ancient stones of the palace walls. The mare had returned to her ceremonial stance, but Sarah could see that the horse remained more alert than before, her ears constantly moving as she monitored the area for any further threats. The incident had clearly affected the animal as well, heightening her defensive instincts and making her job more difficult. Sarah's romantic notions about connecting with British royal tradition lay in shambles around her feet, along with the scattered sugar cube that had started this entire disaster. She was beginning to understand that her tourist adventure was about to take a very different direction than she had planned. The security officer finished writing in his notebook and looked up at Sarah with an expression that mixed official duty with genuine concern. "Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me to complete an incident report. What happened here today is considered a security breach, and there are protocols that must be followed." Sarah's heart sank as the full implications of her actions began to dawn on her. This wasn't just going to be an embarrassing story to tell friends back home. This was becoming an official matter that could seriously impact the rest of her vacation. Her mind raced with questions about what this might mean for her travel plans, her visa status, and even her ability to remain in the country. The officer gestured toward a discreet doorway in one of the palace buildings that Sarah hadn't even noticed before. As they walked across the courtyard, Sarah was acutely aware of the stares and whispered conversations following their progress. Several tourists were still taking pictures, and she cringed at the thought of her mortifying moment being shared across social media platforms around the world. The mare and her rider had returned to their ceremonial duties, but Sarah could see that additional guards had been positioned nearby. The increased security presence was a direct result of her actions, and she felt the weight of responsibility for disrupting what should have been a routine morning at one of Britain's most important landmarks. Inside the building, Sarah found herself in a small, austere office that was clearly designed for handling tourist incidents and security matters. The walls were lined with official notices in multiple languages, warning visitors about appropriate behavior around the guards and horses. Sarah realized with growing shame that if she had simply read these posted rules, none of this would have happened. The security officer introduced himself as Sergeant Williams and explained that he would need to document every detail of the incident for official records. Sarah learned that interactions with royal horses were taken extremely seriously, not just for tourist safety, but for national security reasons as well. The horses are considered part of the security apparatus, Sergeant Williams explained as he prepared his paperwork. Any unauthorized contact or attempt to distract them from their duties is treated as a potential security threat. These animals are highly trained and extremely valuable, both historically and practically. Sarah listened in growing dismay as Sergeant Williams outlined the various regulations she had unknowingly violated. Approaching the horses without permission, attempting to feed them, and creating a disturbance that required additional security response were all serious infractions that could result in formal charges. The paperwork process was thorough and intimidating. Sarah had to provide her passport information, her hotel details, her complete itinerary for the remainder of her stay in the UK, and contact information for family members back in the United States. Each form drove home the seriousness with which British authorities treated security incidents at royal facilities. During the questioning, Sarah learned more about the horses and their training than she had ever imagined. These weren't simply ceremonial animals. They were working security assets trained to detect threats, control crowds, and protect their riders in potentially dangerous situations. Her innocent gesture with the sugar cube had triggered responses that were built into the animal's military conditioning. Sergeant Williams explained that the horses undergo years of specialized training that cost the government thousands of pounds per animal. They are selected for their intelligence, temperament, and physical capabilities, then subjected to rigorous conditioning that makes them reliable partners in crowd control and ceremonial duties. Sarah's interference had disrupted this careful training and potentially endangered both herself and the animal. The implications of her actions extended far beyond the immediate incident. Sarah learned that her behavior had been recorded by multiple security cameras positioned throughout the palace grounds. The footage would be reviewed by various departments, and copies would likely be filed with immigration authorities and potentially shared with American embassy officials. The good news, Sergeant Williams said after completing several forms, is that you weren't injured and the horse wasn't harmed. However, there will be consequences for your actions that extend beyond this conversation. Sarah was informed that she would be banned from approaching within 50 meters of any royal guard or horse for the remainder of her stay in the United Kingdom. This restriction would be noted in official databases and enforced at all royal properties, tourist attractions, and ceremonial events. Her dream vacation was rapidly becoming a very restricted and supervised experience. The financial implications were equally sobering. Sarah learned that she might be liable for costs associated with the additional security response her incident had triggered. Multiple guards had been diverted from their regular duties, security protocols had been activated, and additional personnel had been called in to assess and contain the situation she had created. Sergeant Williams also explained that her incident would be reported to her travel insurance company and would likely affect her coverage for any future claims related to her UK visit. The documentation of her reckless behavior around security assets would become part of her permanent travel record. As the questioning continued, Sarah began to understand how her rural American perspective on horses had clashed dramatically with British military tradition and security protocols. The casual, friendly relationships she had enjoyed with farm animals bore no resemblance to the highly regulated interactions surrounding these ceremonial horses. The officer's radio crackled, periodically with updates from other security personnel. Sarah caught references to incident containment, tourist education, protocols, and media monitoring. She realized with growing horror that her moment of poor judgment had triggered a comprehensive official response that extended far beyond what she could see in the immediate area. "Miss Mitchell," Sergeant Williams said as he finished the last of his paperwork, "I want to be clear about something. What happened today could have resulted in serious injury or death. These horses weigh over half a ton and are trained to strike when they perceive threats. You were extraordinarily lucky that the mare's response was as restrained as it was." Sarah nodded numbly, finally beginning to grasp the true danger she had placed herself in. Her romantic notions about gentle interaction with a beautiful horse had nearly resulted in her being seriously injured or killed by a highly trained military animal. The sugar cube that had seemed like such a harmless gesture could have cost her everything. The sergeant's tone became slightly less official as he prepared to release her. "I've been handling tourist incidents here for 15 years, Miss Mitchell, and I've seen similar situations result in broken bones, concussions, and even fatalities. These horses are not pets or photo opportunities. They're working animals with serious jobs to do." As Sarah prepared to leave the office, Sergeant Williams handed her a thick packet of documents. These included copies of the incident report, official warnings about future conduct, contact information for legal assistance if needed, and detailed maps showing all the areas where her new restrictions would apply. "Your hotel will be notified of these restrictions," the sergeant explained.
"We'll also be coordinating with other tourist
attractions and transport authorities to ensure you understand the limitations that are now in place for the remainder of your visit." Sarah looked at the packet in her hands and realized that her simple mistake had transformed her dream vacation into a carefully monitored and heavily restricted experience. Every day of her remaining time in London would now be shaped by the consequences of a single moment of poor judgment. Sarah stepped out of the security office into the bright London morning, but the world felt completely different than it had just 2 hours earlier. The packet of documents in her hands felt heavier than her entire camera bag, weighted with the reality of how dramatically her vacation had changed in a single moment of poor judgment. The palace grounds looked the same, but Sarah now saw them through entirely different eyes. Every guard, every horse, every security camera represented a potential source of additional trouble. The magical atmosphere she had felt that morning had been replaced by an acute awareness of rules, restrictions, and consequences. Her phone buzzed with notifications as she walked slowly back toward her hotel. Word of the incident had apparently spread quickly through social media, with several tourist bloggers and travel websites already posting warnings about approaching royal horses. Sarah discovered with mortification that photos of her encounter were already circulating online, complete with commentary about clueless American tourists and why you should never feed the horses. At her hotel, the desk clerk handed her an official notice that had been delivered just minutes after her departure that morning. The document, printed on formal government letterhead, officially notified the hotel management of the restrictions that had been placed on their guest. Sarah watched the clerk's expression change from professional courtesy to barely concealed concern as he read through the notice. "Miss Mitchell," the clerk said carefully, "I'm afraid we'll need to discuss some modifications to your planned activities during your stay. Several of the tours and attractions you've booked will need to be canceled or altered due to these new restrictions." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the full scope of how her incident would affect her remaining time in London. The Tower of London, Windsor Castle, and several other major attractions all employed royal guards and horses, making them off-limits for the duration of her visit. Her carefully planned itinerary, months in the making, was crumbling before her eyes. Back in her room, Sarah spread all her travel documents across the small table and began trying to understand exactly what she could and couldn't do for the rest of her vacation. The restriction map covered most of central London, creating a complex web of areas she needed to avoid entirely. Her travel insurance company proved to be another source of stress when she called to report the incident. The representative explained that her policy contained exclusions for damages or restrictions resulting from reckless or illegal behavior at government or royal facilities. Not only would they not cover any costs associated with the incident, but her future coverage for international travel might be affected as well. The American embassy was Sarah's next call, hoping to understand what impact this incident might have on her ability to travel in the future. The consular officer she spoke with was professional, but frank about the potential consequences. Official security incidents at royal facilities were taken seriously by all nations, and the documentation could affect her visa applications for years to come. Sarah's family back in Ohio was simultaneously worried and bewildered when she called to explain what had happened. Her grandmother, who had taught her everything she knew about horses, was particularly upset to learn that her granddaughter's equine knowledge had actually contributed to the problem rather than preventing it. "Sarah, honey," her grandmother said over the crackling international connection, "those aren't farm horses. They're soldiers just like the men riding them. You can't treat them like pets any more than you could treat a police officer like your neighbor." The wisdom of her grandmother's words stung because they came too late to prevent the disaster. Sarah realized that her confidence around horses had made her overconfident in a situation that required completely different skills and knowledge. Her rural American experience had actually made her more dangerous, not safer in this urban British context. Over the following days, Sarah discovered that her incident had become something of a cautionary tale within London's tourism industry. Hotel concierges were using her story to educate other American visitors about appropriate behavior around ceremonial guards and horses. Tour guides were incorporating warnings about her mistake into their standard presentations. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she had achieved a kind of fame in London, just not the kind she had hoped for. Instead of being the tourist who got the perfect photograph, she had become the tourist whose mistake served as a warning to others. Her story was being retold daily to hundreds of visitors as an example of what not to do. Despite the restrictions and embarrassment, Sarah tried to salvage what remained of her vacation. She discovered parts of London she never would have visited otherwise, exploring neighborhoods and attractions that fell outside her restriction zones. The British Museum, various markets, and several parks became her refugees from the central areas where her presence was no longer welcome. Local news outlets eventually picked up the story, though they treated it more as a human interest piece about cultural misunderstandings than a serious security breach. Sarah found herself reluctantly grateful for the relatively gentle coverage. Though seeing her name in London newspapers was surreal and uncomfortable, the financial impact continued to mount as her week progressed. Cancelled tour bookings, additional hotel charges for extended stays while she figured out alternative plans, and the cost of completely reorganizing her itinerary added up quickly. What had begun as a budget-conscious vacation was becoming an expensive lesson in international protocol. Sarah also discovered that her restriction wasn't just about avoiding specific locations. It affected her ability to move freely throughout the city. Many tube stations, bus routes, and walking paths passed through restricted zones, forcing her to take longer, more expensive routes to reach her destinations. The psychological impact proved to be as significant as the practical consequences. Sarah found herself constantly anxious about inadvertently violating her restrictions or creating another incident. Every police officer, security guard, or official-looking person she encountered made her heart race with worry about additional consequences she might face. Her confidence as a traveler had been shattered, along with her vacation plans. The independent, adventurous spirit that had brought her to London in the first place had been replaced by cautious anxiety and constant second-guessing. She began to understand how a single moment of poor judgment could have effects that rippled through every aspect of her life. As her departure date approached, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of travel, tourism, and cultural differences had changed. She had learned harsh lessons about the importance of research, respect for local customs, and the serious nature of security protocols in a post-9/11 world. The mayor's dramatic response to her sugar cube had taught her far more than any guidebook or travel blog ever could have. Sometimes the most important lessons came not from successful experiences, but from spectacular failures that forced you to see the world in an entirely new way. 6 months after returning from London, Sarah sat in her small apartment in Ohio, scrolling through social media posts from other travelers visiting Buckingham Palace. The familiar surge of embarrassment still washed over her whenever she saw photos of tourists posing safely behind barriers, following the rules she had so carelessly ignored. Her story had taken on a life of its own in travel communities across the internet. Travel bloggers used her experience as a cautionary tale. Tourism websites featured her incident in their safety sections, and even some guidebooks had begun, including warnings that referenced the American tourist who tried to feed a royal horse without mentioning her name. The immediate consequences of her London disaster had eventually faded, but the lasting effects continued to shape her life in unexpected ways. Her travel insurance rates had increased significantly when she renewed her policy, and she had discovered that certain visa applications now required additional documentation about her incident in the UK. Sarah had initially been devastated by the thought that her mistake might affect her future travel opportunities. The dream of becoming a seasoned international traveler seemed crushed under the weight of official documents and restrictions. However, as the months passed, she began to realize that her experience had taught her lessons that no amount of guidebook reading could have provided. Her perspective on tourism and cultural sensitivity had been fundamentally altered by those terrifying moments at Buckingham Palace. She now researched destinations with obsessive thoroughness, reading not just tourist information but local laws, customs, and cultural expectations. Her travel planning had evolved from casual browsing to serious academic study. The incident had also sparked an unexpected interest in equine behavior and training. Sarah enrolled in courses at a local community college to better understand the differences between companion animals and working animals. She learned about the psychological conditioning that makes military and police horses so different from the farm horses she had grown up around. Her newfound knowledge led to volunteer work at a therapeutic riding center, where she helped veterans and disabled children work with specially trained horses. The irony wasn't lost on her that her disastrous encounter with a royal horse had ultimately led to meaningful work helping others benefit from positive human-animal relationships. Sarah's employer had initially been understanding about her London experience, but as months passed, her newfound caution and research skills made her valuable in ways she hadn't expected. Her marketing coordinator role evolved to include responsibilities for international campaigns, where her hard-learned lessons about cultural sensitivity proved invaluable to the company. She began writing articles for travel websites, sharing her experience not as a source of shame, but as a genuine educational tool for other travelers. Her honest account of the incident and its consequences resonated with readers who appreciated her willingness to discuss the real risks of international travel mistakes. The financial impact of her London incident had been substantial, but Sarah used it as motivation to better manage her finances and plan more carefully for future travel. She created a detailed savings plan that included emergency funds, specifically designated for potential travel complications or legal issues. Her relationship with her grandmother had actually strengthened following the incident. The older woman's initial disappointment had given way to pride in how Sarah had handled the consequences and learned from her mistakes. They spent hours discussing the differences between working animals and pets, conversations that enriched both their understanding. Sarah's social media presence evolved from typical tourist snapshots to thoughtful posts about responsible travel and cultural awareness. Her followers appreciated her honest approach to discussing travel mistakes and the real-world consequences of poor decisions abroad. The mare that had changed. Sarah's life remained a frequent subject of her thoughts. She often wondered if the horse remembered their brief, dramatic encounter, or if it had simply been another day at the office for a well-trained military animal. Sarah had learned that the mare's name was Duchess, and she was considered one of the most reliable horses in the ceremonial guard. Through her research, Sarah discovered that Duchess had served in the Royal Guard for over 8 years, participating in countless ceremonies and parades without incident. Sarah's attempt to feed her had been an anomaly in an otherwise exemplary career of service and discipline. A year after the incident, Sarah received an unexpected email from Sergeant Williams, the security officer who had handled her case. He was writing to inform her that her travel restrictions had been officially lifted, and she would be welcome to visit royal properties again, provided she followed all posted guidelines. The email included an invitation to participate in an educational program for tourists that had been developed partly in response to incidents like hers. The program would involve sharing her story with other visitors to help them understand the serious nature of security protocols at royal facilities. Sarah found herself torn between wanting to forget the entire experience and feeling a responsibility to help prevent others from making similar mistakes. After weeks of consideration, she decided to accept the invitation and return to London, this time as an educator rather than a tourist. Her second trip to Buckingham Palace was profoundly different from her first. Standing behind the proper barriers, watching new tourists take photographs with appropriate respect for the guards and horses, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in how far she had come, lingering embarrassment about her mistake, and genuine satisfaction in knowing that her story might prevent others from experiencing similar consequences. During her educational presentation to a group of American tourists, Sarah stood just meters from where her incident had occurred. She could see Duchess in the distance, still serving with the same dignity and professionalism that had made Sarah's intrusion so inappropriate. One tourist in Sarah's group asked if she regretted her experience, given all the negative consequences it had brought. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering that, while she wouldn't recommend her approach to anyone, the lessons she had learned had ultimately made her a better traveler, a more culturally sensitive person, and someone who truly understood the importance of respecting local customs and security protocols. As Sarah concluded her presentation and watched the tourists disperse to continue their properly planned and respectfully conducted visits, she realized that her story had come full circle. What had begun as a moment of thoughtless enthusiasm had evolved into a meaningful contribution to international understanding and tourist education. Her last act before leaving London was to make a donation to the organization that cared for the royal horses, including Duchess. It seemed like a small gesture of gratitude to the magnificent animal, whose dramatic response had ultimately changed Sarah's life for the better, even if it had taken time for her to recognize the gift hidden within the disaster.